The gospel, or the good news, throughout all 66 books of the Bible, is the fact that God desires to restore relationship with humanity and subsequently with the rest of creation. I think it's a broader definition of the gospel that, of course, includes the works that Jesus did on the cross, but the same subject. God desires to restore relationship with all of humanity and with the rest of the created world, is the good news that was shared in all 66 books of the Bible. As we saw in the introductory videos, Israel's history and the books of the Bible can be broken down into 10 contexts for ease of study. And in this first video, I want to talk about the gospel before Israel. In other words, why did the world need this family and nation of Israel to receive and believe in God's promises and walk in obedience to them? And why did Moses need to compile, edit, and write the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah? Well, I'm going to focus in this section on the book of Genesis to pull out some of those background facts that show the need, particularly for the book of Genesis in the nation of Israel. So this is the timeline that we're using. All 39 books of the Old Testament linked to the historical events of ancient Israel and color-coded according to the type of literature. That's the timeline right there. And those are the color-coded types of literature in the Old Testament. You should study these first before you continue into the rest of these videos. If you don't have a grasp of this timeline, it makes it a little bit tough. You may miss the storyline, and that kind of messes up your doctrine. We're going to start with Genesis 1 through 11 to get the heart of the background of the nations at the time. And then we're going to walk through the rest. So first is this pre-Israel context. The reason I use these shaded areas is I want you to forget about the rest of the Bible. I don't want you to give any churchy answers. Look for Jesus, but don't look for the easy answer. Really dig into the details of the faith of the original audience. And we're in section number 1, pre-Israel, and we're going to focus on Genesis and mostly Genesis 1 through 11. This is just a very, very brief overview, and I'm going to show you something that's interesting to me, an archaeological fact that's really helped me with the book of Genesis. But let's look at really the philosophy, why Israel was needed. They were needed because a huge contrast needed to be made, the true worldview versus that which had developed. So for 1,000 years before Moses, Mesopotamia and Egypt had extensive civilizations and incredible literature, and they'd made many myths, and in fact ended up making gods of those in power. Now, it's my theory that this is idolatry when you make gods of people who are in power, but it actually comes from worship of physical and natural resources and processes. This is just Cliff's theory. If you worship the food that you're getting, then naturally those who are powerful and who can control the food can end up being worshipped as well. I believe that results in enslaved national cultures. And I would see that the worship of the pharaohs, I think, enslaved the Egyptians, if you believe the biblical worldview. The Mesopotamian kings also created just genius stories that connected them to the gods and enforced their will over the people using the excuse that they were descended from the gods. Well, this is a huge contrast with Genesis 1 through 11. In Genesis 1 through 11, you find out that all mankind suffers because they've rejected God as Father and King. There's no one who doesn't. Everyone who is descended from Adam and Eve is fallen because of the same reason. There are no God kings other than Jesus, right? Well, here's where we really find a cool contrast is Israel's patriarchs in Genesis 12 through 50, instead of being this perfect vision of superpowers or anything like that. They actually turn out to be really flawed people with broken families, sinners, just like everybody else on earth. However, there's the contrast. They were free, these patriarchs in Israel. They made choices and trusted God's promises and watched God come through. And what they did was righteous, through acts of faith and trust in the Creator God. Totally different, because their relationship with God was above nature. They didn't worship nature, and was above all leaders. They didn't worship leaders because all leaders were fallen, just like they were. Well, the patriarchs had preserved this mindset, and it really was revolutionary. This mindset totally challenged a millennium of Egyptian and Mesopotamian worldview or cultures, how they shaped their cultures using mythology. Which one would you choose? The one in which the leaders are gods, or the one in which everyone is everyone is equal, equally fallen, and equally in need of a relationship, of a restored relationship with the Father? My choice is simple, but I think this is the context for the preservation and communication of the creation narrative in Genesis. Well, here's that sideline that I'm interested in. Where did Genesis come from? And I think it came from Moses' clay tablet library. And I think Moses had a clay tablet library, just like you see up in the left, of these Mesopotamian clay tablets, which were written upon in the style of writing called cuneiform in several different languages. But I think Moses had a stack of these tablets, and I think that they were Israel's family history. And I believe this is the structure of the book of Genesis, and I'll show you in a minute why. This is not my opinion. It's an opinion of a guy named P.J. Wiseman back in 1946. He's an old-timer. I just thought it was super helpful to me. Well, here's some vocabulary. A Toledoth. It's actually just Hebrew for the words. These are the generations of, and people translate them differently. This is the family of. This is the family record of. But it's all just this Hebrew word called Toledoth. In Genesis, there's a bunch of them, such as these are the generations of heaven and earth. These are the generations of Adam. These are the generations of Seth. Blah blah blah. It's 11 times in Genesis. And I believe this is the author's intent. This structure of the Toledoths in the book of Genesis is the strongest evidence for the message of the book of Genesis. I believe that understanding the framework of the Toledoths actually gives you the context within which to interpret all of the awesome, amazing stories that are packed into the book of Genesis. And man, they are deep. So understand this structure of Genesis, these 11 Toledoths. Well, turns out P.J. Wiseman discovered there's another thing called a colophon. And a colophon was in a Babylonian technique where they would write on the edges of the clay tablets as an index. And they would write out the author and the setting on the edges of each of these clay tablets. Now, this is genius because it sure sounds like a colophon when you read the Toledoths in the book of Genesis. So here's my theory. It's not my theory, it's P.J. Wiseman's, and I've made this picture or a diagram like I always do to see if it makes sense to you. There's these clay tablets. My theory then is that Moses was using these clay tablets. They had been preserved and handed off to him eventually through the 400 years of Egyptian slavery. And I want to walk you through them. The first one, of course, is God's record, and it's the first part of Genesis. And you'll see at the end of chapter 1, and actually it's in 2, verse 4, then it says, hey, these are the records, or the family records. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth. And I love that because that means all heaven and all earth is Father God's family, including mankind. And that first section is the oldest tablet that Moses had. Possibly. The second tablet, of course, would be the person who's next, and that's Adam. So Adam writes his record, and it ends in chapter 5 after the horrible fall of his son Cain. The next record is, of course, collected by Adam's descendant, Noah. And Noah records the genealogy that led from Adam through Seth all the way to Noah. And Noah's record ends before the flood. In other words, he writes his family record up to the birth of his sons. And then the next section, written by his sons, as a team apparently, it ends in chapter 10. And then the next tablet would be written by the favored son, Shem. And Shem is the father of the Semite clan, which makes sense. Over the hundreds of years that Shem lived, he saw his clan developing into the Semites, and many people groups were coming out of that. And of course, the Hebrews ended up coming from his family. And he kept a record of what happened after the flood. Then we get to the next record, and it's funny. It's not Abraham, but Abraham's dad keeps a record just of the genealogy leading down to his sons, his 3 sons. And then he finishes his genealogy, and then the next story, again, no Abraham. It was Abraham's eldest, Ishmael, claims, if this colophon theory is correct, Ishmael then keeps the family's record. In other words, Ishmael is preserving the philosophy that is implied by the history of his family leading all the way back to God as the father of Adam and Eve in the garden. Good job, Ishmael. Now, Ishmael, again, was supposed to be the head, the leaders of the Arabs, the whole nation of 12 princes that created the Arab nation. But he wasn't the inheritor of the promise, and Isaac was. So there's this short section that Isaac, Wiseman called it an add-on to Ishmael's record, and talks about Ishmael's death, of course. Then the last 3 are Esau and his brother. So Esau writes one record. He writes another short record talking about how awesome he is. And then his brother, who once again is the inheritor of the land, includes records of the kings that came out of his brother Esau. But then there's no more colophons. There's no colophon at the end, which is so strange, given the importance of this family genealogy that's collected in the book of Genesis. And Wiseman says, hey, it actually makes sense. Jacob wrote his in Israel. They may have been continuing to use clay tablets this whole time. It's very likely. But in Egypt, they used papyrus. So if Joseph's sons were the ones who kept the family records together, then they would have written in papyrus in Egypt. And it turns out that the language has a lot of Egyptian borrowed words in it. So really cool theory, because what that says is the sons of Joseph preserved these clay tablets throughout the captivity in Egypt, and eventually Moses got a hold of them, edited them, compiled them, put them together in the book of Genesis, which is our name for it, and then wrote a nice smooth transition to the book of Exodus. Once again, this is P.J. Wiseman's theory, not mine. It so helped me to see how clearly this was an inheritance, this idea or this worldview that's communicated from the creation narrative, and it's consistent throughout thousands of years of human history, preserved by this faithful clan, the Semites, and then edited, collected, and given to the nation of Israel as its inheritance. Here, if you understand this book, you're going to be able to walk into the future that God has for you. That's how awesome Genesis is. So once again, I'm going to do a wrap-up for each of these sections. I'm calling this the spiritual temperature of Israel. And this first section is actually the whole world, and the spiritual temperature just tanked. It went from the garden all the way to the flood when God judged mankind for violence and for perversion of the family. They'd lost the image of God, and God judged them in the flood. But then this great guy named Abram, when he got saved, heard God in the desert. He's an Iraqi guy who heard God and believed him and obeyed. After that, there was the captivity, and I make this a downward sloping thing, even though I don't think that going to Egypt was necessarily disobedience to God. But I think that during the next over 300 years in captivity, that I'd say that was a downward or broken relationship to some degree with God. Now, here's your assignment. These first 5 books are the gift of Israel. This is the foundation block of the nation of Israel, and it should be the foundation block of your faith. If you just want to focus on Genesis for now, just do that. But if you can wrap all these books up and ask yourself, why did the world need Israel to be faithful to the philosophy of God, to the heart of God, really, as communicated in the first 5 books of the Bible? I want you to dig really deep. And the tool I'm going to have you guys use, obviously the Bible's number one. I'm using worldview questions. Who is God? And who is humanity? What is the meaning and purpose of life? Why is there suffering and death? And where does morality come from? Each of these 10 sections are going to take some time and effort. Answer these 5 questions to the degree that you find them in the first 5 books of the Bible. If you spend some time doing this, you're going to get some answers, and you're going to know why the world needs the gospel. And suddenly I think your faith is going to grow. You're going to have an understanding that otherwise you would have never reached. So here's my sign-off page. If you want to watch more videos, look up CSBS International or CSBS Global on YouTube. You can look at the SBS, which is School of Biblical Studies International.org, which is the school system that we come from in YWAM. They're our mothership, and we are just the chronological version. You can email us at chronologicalsbs.international, so csbs.international@gmail.com. Here's why I'm making these videos, my friends. You can know Jesus without knowing the Bible, and all new believers do. You get to meet Jesus, you get to hear him and feel his love and his forgiveness without knowing the Bible. But then God starts asking you to do a little bit more. He wants you to understand. But we may not understand Jesus until we understand Jesus' history, the teachings and the culture of Israel over the 1,500 years before Jesus, those things which Jesus fulfilled. This is why I'm making these videos. I hope this first video helped. Do your homework. Answer those 5 worldview questions in the first 5 books of the Bible and find out why the world needs the gospel in the Torah. God bless you.